1 year in the big bad world of video games can be a lifetime, and in Ghostwire Tokyo it can be several. In the time that it's taken for the PS5 exclusive to shift over to Series X and Series S, have they improved some of the issues on the PlayStation 5 launch code, or are there still quite a few ghosts in the machine? Well, first things first, this is pretty much a clean port from the PlayStation 5 over to both Xbox consoles, which means we get the same modes on the Series X at least of quality performance and then high frame rate quality, high frame rate performance. And these come with two options, one with VSync off and one with VSync on, which means if you have a VRR screen, use the one without VSync, and if it goes above 120 FPS, so basically 144 Hz or higher, you'll get slightly better potential frame rates because you're not limited to 8 milliseconds. And if you have a 60 Hz screen with VRR, then use that option as well, because it means you'll still get slightly better performance, which might mean the gap between 30 and 60 doesn't feel quite as bad. That's simply it. If you have a flat 60 Hz screen, then just flick it on with VSync engaged and you'll get 60 FPS in the high frame rate quality mode and performance mode. But without it, you'll just get 60 FPS in the performance mode as standard and 30 FPS in the quality mode without it. So how else do these modes differ? Well, the quality and performance modes are not drastically different. The quality mode, at least on the PS5, targets 2880 by 1620, and it runs with ray trace reflections and some limited amount of hybrid ray trace shadows. The Series X comes in slightly lower with a resolution of 2688 by 1512. Again, fully fixed on both of these modes here with no dynamic scaling present, and it does appear to be using Unreal Engine 4's TAAU and lots of TAA, so it's quite a noisy image overall, and it tries to reconstruct that back to 2160p. This means you get a slightly higher resolution on the PS5, but it's almost indistinguishable in normal play, but you are capped at 30 FPS with those ray trace reflections and shadows, which runs on both consoles, but they are of a lower quality on the Xbox Series X, which looks to be related to an API choice here, with the PS5 potentially using a checkerboarded solution which we saw in Insomniac's titles to get back to a higher quality ray trace reflections and even shadows, which the Series X doesn't have, and therefore it has much lower quality reflections and shadows in both the quality mode and the high frame rate quality mode, which you can see in these comparisons. In addition, there might also be bugs in the API on the DirectX side for Series X, because there are points where it looks like either ray trace shadows are missing or they're just misaligned in the BVH. Not quite sure what's going on there, but there are points here where you can see differences between the two. Realistically though, it's not a huge delta outside of staring at the reflections, which are sharper and cleaner on the PlayStation 5. Moving to performance mode, we lower the resolution down. Now both of them target the same resolution of 2304 by 1296, again attempting to reconstruct that back to 1440p. It's certainly a softer image and it loses the ray trace reflections and shadows, but it does gain slightly better SSR, which can mean at certain points in comparisons you get better reflections because SSR can take all of that screen data, which is a limited subset in the BVH that the ray trace solution uses. Overall though, even though it is a nice touch to have these ray trace reflections, the SSR does a pretty decent job running around these wet Tokyo streets. So it is the one that I would choose over the quality mode, but there's more on why that is the choice I'll get to in a moment. And then finally, if you move to those high frame rate modes, then both quality and performance now just target 1080p. A flat 1080p, you still keep the ray trace reflections and shadows in both modes on the Series X and PlayStation 5, but they are now obviously of a lower quality resolution overall because it's dropped to 1080p. But the performance mode dropping 44% from that 1296p to 1080p doesn't make that much of a difference, and all other effects are identical, obviously aside the resolution delta, which will reduce things like texture filtering, screen space reflections and screen space ambient occlusion. So visually we now know how they stack up. What about performance? Well, quality mode is quite a simple conversation for the PlayStation 5. Fully locked, 30 FPS, completely smooth, no frame pacing issues. All my tested sections here, I found no issues from cutscene to gameplay. Everything ran completely smooth with no issues at all. So if you want a completely locked 30 FPS with the highest visual quality and ray tracing, then certainly the PlayStation 5 has you covered. The Series X is close, but it certainly is not the same. Again, it has a lower resolution as mentioned, but it also has frame pacing issues. Now, far from terrible, they do crop up quite often, and this again looks like memory management issues. You get stutters and judders from 33 milliseconds, 16, even 50 milliseconds quite often, and this can make the game feel inconsistent whilst you're playing. This can happen whilst you're working through the city, fighting battles in a closed off room, or even just watching cinematics play through. So be aware that there are some issues in the 30 FPS mode. It's certainly the most consistent in terms of keeping closest to the 30 FPS target, as most of the time it is 30 frames per second. It's the fact that the frame pacing issues cause all of these problems, and therefore it can feel like it's dropping frames when really it's just intermittently jumping between 33, 16 and 50 milliseconds. So next we have the performance mode. This is the higher resolution 1296p version, and although both target 60 FPS, they do not hit it locked. Even just walking through quieter city streets, you can see somewhere in the mid 50s on the Series X and closer to that on the PS5. The PS5 in heavier battles can drop to the low 50s, and the Series X can drop to the mid 40s, which means it can be on average around 6 to 7% slower on the Series X over the PlayStation 5, and some of this is GPU related, with heavy GPU particles, SSR and alpha effects all causing dips under that target of 60 FPS, to the point where it is consistently below that target on both consoles, to simply be a mode that I could not recommend to play on anyone's machine, because even though it is a sharper image for performance, it certainly doesn't get close enough to input latency and response to be one that I could recommend. So next up, the high frame rate mode in the quality section means you can cap it at 60 FPS on a 60Hz screen. You still get the same ray trace reflections and hybrid ray trace shadows, but it's now running at 1080p. And it can do a pretty decent job in the quieter sections of holding 60 FPS, but both consoles can still dip below that. And this is reinforced by my high frame rate 120Hz version here, which shows that the PS5 does hover close enough to 60 FPS to be a viable option now, and it can actually feel quite smooth, helped out by its 8 millisecond refresh rate that it can flip between. Unfortunately, the Series X cannot deliver the same level of consistency, often being somewhere between 33 and even 50 milliseconds in this mode, leaving you with somewhere around the mid-40s often at certain points. They're not GPU heavy, again pointing to memory and or CPU issues, which means this isn't a mode that I could recommend either on the Series X. But the high frame rate performance mode is one that I can recommend, and in fact it's the only one that I recommend on the Series X. It's certainly close enough to 60 FPS to be the one that feels the smoothest overall, and even though it can again dip into the 33 and even 41 milliseconds at its worst point, it certainly feels smooth enough and more consistent than any other mode on the Series X. Again, it can be around 8 to 12% on average slower than the PlayStation 5, which never skips out of that 16 millisecond as a worst case scenario. And overall, when you compare the high frame rate quality mode to the high frame rate performance mode on the Series X, you're effectively looking at the same delta as the Series X and PlayStation 5 in its high frame rate quality mode. So what about the Series S then? Well, unsurprisingly, this has a reduced level of options and menus. So it means you only have two modes now, quality mode and performance mode. No high frame rate options, and neither of them run ray tracing, with them only using SSR. This means that the quality mode on the Series S is actually a comparison almost directly to the performance mode on the Series X and PlayStation 5, meaning you get the same 1296p output resolution, but no ray tracing and no ray trace shadows. The performance mode drops this even further down to 1600 by 900, but it now tries to target 60 FPS, with the quality mode being capped at 30 no matter what. In terms of visual comparisons, the lack of ray tracing is an obvious one, but also the resolution reflections on SSR are of a lower quality even at the same resolution, and on top of this, the lower resolution of effects and then down to the performance mode at 900p can look a little softer, but it's not a huge difference in reality. What is, though, is the performance deficit. The quality mode at 30 FPS has the same and probably slightly worse inconsistent frame pacing that we saw on the Series X, and this can cause judder and stutter as you're playing. Again, it holds close to 30 FPS most of the time, but the frame delivery is very inconsistent, which feels the same as dropped frames. So again, it's not a mode that I can sadly recommend, because even though it's got the best image quality, it's certainly got far and away the worst input latency and performance, which leaves the performance mode as the only option, and really it's not a great one. It hovers somewhere around the 40s at best, and in heavy combat it can even dip below that point, often being somewhere around 45 FPS on average in battle, which leaves the Series S somewhere in the realms of almost unplayable at certain points. You either pick bad frame pacing in the 30 FPS mode, or just very inconsistent frame pacing in the performance mode with a much softer image, and that really isn't a great choice for a title that came a year after its exclusivity deal on the PlayStation 5. But right now, the Series S is far and away the worst version of the three. So overall, this is not a great look on the Series X. It doesn't have better image quality, it doesn't have better effects, and it has worse performance than every mode on the PlayStation 5. There's obviously a chance that the team could patch this on Series S and Series X, but 12 months after its launch on PlayStation 5, that seems incredibly slim. Overall, not a title that I can recommend on any Xbox console, and even though it's not great on the PlayStation 5, it's certainly better than what we've got here on the Xbox consoles. And that's it for another quick and fast dive into technology, games, graphics, and all things console performance related. If you like what we do here on IGN Performance Reviews, then keep it IGN, and we'll catch you on the next one.
どうした？こんなところでくたばるんじゃねえ。